Well, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be starting Chapter 6, Launching the New Nation. So now that we have seen all of the debating and all of the writing and the ratification eventually of the Constitution, now we are getting into the first couple of presidential administrations of the early republic. We're really going to cover quite a lot of ground in this one chapter, looking at, for a good bit of time, the Washington administration and looking at some of those really formative things taking place in the very first presidency and the first Congress. We'll eventually look at Adams as well as Jefferson and Madison, concluding with the War of 1812 in this chapter. So that's kind of considered to be kind of one of the earliest periods, the early building of the Republic from the Washington administration beginning in 1791 until the War of 1812, which concludes in 1814, 1815. So we're going to be looking at a lot of big events and the United States really figuring itself out and figuring out exactly what this new Constitution means, exactly what their place in the world is going to be, and really setting the path for the United States for the next many, many, many decades to come, and also seeing some of the arguments and debates and questions that we're going to continue to see for many, many, many decades to come. So we're going to begin again by looking at the Washington administration. All of this section is going to be about the very first presidential administration, that, of course, of George Washington, that I'm sure everybody knows. And I think Washington is one of those presidents that, there really wasn't much question. Probably the only president in which there was really no question about who people wanted to be president and who people saw as really being the only option for president. Not just because Washington had military leadership and all of those things, but Washington just was not a power-hungry individual. He just wasn't, and he had proven that many times in his military career of not taking over power and things like that. So Washington, of course, becomes the first president. And as the first president, that means that there's a lot that he has to kind of figure out. As we mentioned when looking at the Constitution, Article 2 of the Constitution does say some specific things about the president, but there's also a lot that it doesn't say. So much of what the president does, what the president doesn't do, a lot of that is left up to Washington's interpretation. And as I mentioned then, the presidency has really been shaped by the people that have held the office, and a lot of that starts with Washington. So throughout our look at the Washington administration, we're going to mention several major precedents that Washington sets. The precedent meaning a standard, something that Washington does that may or may not be written into the Constitution, or perhaps is written very vaguely into the Constitution. But because Washington does this thing, or he does it a certain way, or in some cases things that he does not do, becomes the precedent. It becomes the standard. It becomes the rule. It becomes the expectation that we tend to have for other presidents, not because they were written into the Constitution, but because Washington does it. And we'll see some of these precedents hold true till today, 200 plus years later. Some of them maybe not so much. But one of those first precedents that Washington is going to set is the appointment of a cabinet. So Washington is going to make sure that he appoints a cabinet, and will utilize that cabinet throughout his presidency. So the appointment of a cabinet becomes something that we expect to see from presidents when they take office. Now, in this case, when we talk about the cabinet, we don't mean the kitchen cabinet where you keep your dishes or other things. In this case, the cabinet means a group of advisors. So these are advisors to the president. They are a group of executive department heads. So the executive branch does include these executive departments. The heads of those departments, and this is how Washington decides to set it up, that the heads of those departments, those secretaries that lead those executive departments that deal with certain policy areas, are advisors to Washington that he appoints. And when I say what some of these offices are, you'll begin to recognize them. Washington's cabinet was relatively small, consisting of a Secretary of War. We now call that the Department of Defense. It includes the postmaster who leads the post office. That is now no longer considered a cabinet post, but we do have a postmaster, an attorney general to lead the Justice Department. But the two that we're going to be the most concerned about, because they are the two that Washington tends to seek advice from the most, and these are also two individuals that couldn't be more different, that disagree on everything, that have fundamental disagreements about the very nature of the United States itself, about the very nature of the Constitution itself, and that is his Secretary of State and his Secretary of War. So before I get to those, let me once again reiterate the point of appointing a cabinet becomes a precedent that other presidents follow. Whenever a new president is coming into office, that's always one of the first big questions is who is going to make up their cabinet? Who are they going to appoint to be the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Education, all the way down to the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, those kind of things. The cabinet has grown significantly over the past couple of centuries to accommodate growth and different things that are policy concerns now that might not have been then. But getting back to Washington's cabinet, the two that we're going to look at are the two that are the most important for our studies because they disagree so much and they have such influence on really important policy in these formative years. One of those is the Secretary of the Treasury. So the Treasury Department is created to oversee the nation's finances, and Washington appoints as his Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, who you may recognize as being one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. He is also a close ally of Washington and a financial genius. And so his financial knowledge is going to be put to good use as Secretary of the Treasury. And we're going to look at some of the things he does with that here shortly. This is why another place that you may or may not recognize, you certainly recognize his face, even if you didn't know it was him. Hamilton is the guy on the $10 bill. And the reason he's on the $10 bill is because he was the first Secretary of the Treasury. Now, we are going to see him butting heads constantly with Washington's Secretary of State. And his Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson, whom, of course, we know as the main author of the Declaration of Independence. And this time, that probably would not have afforded him some kind of a celebrity status. That kind of comes later. He will later go on to be president himself, but here he is Secretary of State. Now let's talk about state here, what that means, because for us in the United States, that's easily confused. We tend to think the State Department and therefore the Secretary of State has something to do with the states like Georgia and Florida or something, but it doesn't. A state just means a government, basically. So foreign policy is the main thing that the Department of State does, is dealing with foreign countries, negotiating treaties, those kinds of things. The State Department is kind of the foreign policy arm of the government. And Jefferson is selected to be the Secretary of State because he has significant experience as a diplomat. He spent the whole Constitution writing era in France as an ambassador. So he has significant experience in this particular area. It's sort of his expertise, and so he is chosen for that purpose. So Washington's cabinet, they get off the bat trying to solve some of the country's problems and address some of the big things that were plaguing the country. And once again, we are almost going to immediately see dispute between Hamilton and Jefferson. These two men could not be more different in the way that they saw things. They just are polar opposites on nearly everything. So we're going to look at where those debates came from and then also talk about how those debates are deeply, deeply rooted in some philosophical differences. And what we're getting towards, it is the differences between Hamilton and Jefferson, or rather the philosophical differences that they tend to represent, that eventually leads to the formation of the very first political parties in this country. And we've been a two-party system ever since. So if you've wondered why do we have the two different political parties and why does that happen, it began in the 1790s. It was not intended. It was something that the framers of the Constitution very much feared and thought would be very, very dangerous, but it ends up just happening anyway. So that's what we're going to eventually be getting to. So one of the big problems, of course, the country has getting on its feet, and I'm going to be going over each of these things individually, so we will go over those one at a time. But the big thing that is such a huge problem, or one of the many things, is the financial situation, the economy. If you recall, under the Articles of Confederation, the economy is basically in total chaos. The country has significant debts that need to be paid. States were not paying debts. There was no national currency. Inflation was crazy. They were nearly bankrupt. And so this is a financial situation that's got to be addressed. And as the Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton is the person who is going to be giving recommendations to President Washington of how to solve this problem. So Hamilton, and again, he is quite the financial genius, really. There really was not anybody else in the country at the time that understood more about finances, about banking. He had just researched that and was just really, really astute in it, and probably one of the few people at the time that truly understood it. Banking is a hard concept, and Hamilton just understands it, and a lot of people don't. But anyway, so he comes up with and proposes which Washington will then propose to Congress this financial plan, Hamilton's financial plan, that's meant to address these problems that they were in. But it's not supposed to just address the immediate problem of debt and economic depression and economic stagnation. Hamilton also has a greater vision for the United States, an economic vision, a way that he wants the United States to go economically. He foresees a United States with a strong economy that is robust, that is diverse, that has businesses, that has banks. He foresees, cities and, just economic growth and development more like a more modern United States. He probably could not have foreseen, exactly what the United States becomes economically, but that's the path he wants to set the United States on. And so his financial plan is not only going to try to address the immediate problems, but also try to set in motion that movement toward economic growth and toward industrial development and manufacturing and businesses and all those kind of things. So as we look at this financial plan, look for that. Look for how it, one, addresses the problem at hand, but also sets the United States on a course towards a certain destination. So the first part of the financial plan is the assumption bill. Hamilton proposes this assumption bill. This has to do with debt. What the assumption bill would do, this proposes assuming the national government assuming the state's debts. In other words, a national government taking over all of the state's debts, consolidating all of that state debt into one big national debt, and the national government paying it off. So instead of waiting on all those individual states that owed money to pay them off on their own time, we put that all together and the national government pays it off as soon as possible. Hamilton thought this was important for a number of reasons. One is we got to get this debt paid off. And he was not, or he kind of felt like the states have had all this time to pay off these debts. They haven't done it, and we can't trust them to do it. The national government has to take over there because it's a liability for all of us and an economic problem for all of us if states are not making good on their debts. And there's some other financial things in there too, but some of it is just simply about getting this done quickly and easily and restoring the credit of the United States, making the United States look like a sound financial country. Now, the other parts of the financial plan have to do with how you're going to pay for that, because it doesn't mean that the states are getting off scot-free and they don't actually pay their debts. It's more like they're going to pay the national government, and the national government is going to write the final check. So here are the next two parts of the financial plan: the tariffs and the excise tax. Both of these would fund the assumption bill. This is how the assumption bill would be paid for. This is partly how the government would get the money to pay for assumption. Tariffs. Now, tariffs, for some reason, I find that students never can remember what they are, but it's really quite simple. Tariffs are taxes on imports. So they are taxes on things imported in from another country, and they were commonly used in these days. So taxes on imports. And Hamilton wants to raise taxes on imports significantly higher. And what tariffs do is that raises money for the government. They are largely used as income. They're sometimes what you call revenue tariffs. They are meant to raise revenue for the government, and that would help pay for assumption. We will talk about tariffs a lot because they tend to be incredibly controversial. You usually have some people that favor tariffs and that favor quite high tariffs, and then we will see those that absolutely hate and despise them. And we're going to see that happening right here and now. Tariffs, the other thing that tariffs do, and this is where we get into Hamilton's kind of overall economic vision and this path toward industrialization and those sorts of things. Tariffs, if you make imports cost more, then people are less likely to buy them. The price will be higher. And so people will be more likely to make locally made, American-made products. So the other ulterior motive here, now this was mostly about revenue more than anything else, but for Hamilton, it was like, if this also gives American businesses and American manufacturing, and this is prior to industrialization, but if it gives American businesses a bit of an edge, if it helps American businesses get off the ground, if it helps us get our foot in the door, then that's good too. So it's mainly about revenue, but it is also about encouraging American businesses. It is about discouraging foreign businesses and foreign imports. So it does really both of those things. The third thing here is the excise tax. Now, this is also meant to fund assumption. An excise tax is a tax paid by the manufacturer of a product, the person who makes the product. So it's an indirect kind of a tax. And Hamilton suggests that be placed on whiskey. So an excise tax on whiskey. This would raise funds. It would do so in a rather indirect way since it's placed on the manufacturer of the product, not necessarily on the consumer. And Hamilton also thinks, hey, there may be some good side effects there. If it makes people drink less, that's pretty good too. So that is how we raise the money. Now, the other big crowning piece of this, the jewel in this for Hamilton, and the part that he saw was essential, especially for his whole economic vision, was the establishment of a national bank. And here's where it gets complicated, because banking is a hard thing to understand. So I just try to explain it as simple terms as possible, but it is a hard concept. A national bank, this is not like the First National Bank or something that you could go and open an account in just down the road this afternoon. This would be a government bank. Okay, this would be a government bank. Think of it as a banker's bank. So this would be a place in which the national government could deposit money. The national government could make loans. They could make loans, probably not out to individual citizens, but they could make loans out to foreign countries, to businesses, to individual states, to smaller banks, and then that money could get flowed out to individual citizens. This would also be a way of issuing currency, that the bank could issue paper currency when needed. And the bank would be essentially a stabilizing force. He wants this because, and he models this off of European countries, the Bank of England, for example, that had banks. He sees this as a way to stabilize the economy. This is about, because the national bank kind of acts a bit like a regulatory force, but this is also about just getting money flowing. We tend to think of banks as like a safe box, that the money stays locked up in there and it doesn't move, but that's really not what banks do. The banks actually get money out there. You put your money in the bank, and then the bank's going to loan that out to somebody else with interest. So they can make money off of the loans, but it also means that there's credit available. There's money flowing out there. There is credit flowing out there that someone could then get a loan to start a business or build a road and that kind of thing. So it is providing capital, providing money, putting money out there that can then be used to invest in economic development. It promotes economic growth. Now, again, that's a hard concept to understand, and it's way more complex than what I just explained. And a lot of people don't understand it, which is one of the big hurdles Hamilton has to overcome, is explaining this. And banking, to a lot of people, particularly in these days, a lot of folks did not trust it. A lot of people saw banking as essentially kind of like gambling. So it's a pretty big hurdle that Hamilton's got to overcome here. So Hamilton believes overall that this financial plan is going to restore American credit. It's going to help us pay off the debt. It's going to make us attractive to foreign investment. It's going to get our economy moving. It's going to get things developing, and it's going to mean economic growth and economic success that's going to be beneficial to everyone in the future. So Hamilton proposes all of this, and some people say, okay, that sounds pretty good. And then there are others that go completely berserk over it. They go absolutely nuts. And some of that is because it's a hard concept, and a lot of folks did not trust banks. But one of the big roadblocks he runs into is going to be Jefferson, which we will see in a number of situations. Jefferson disagrees with all of this. Jefferson dislike every single bit of it. He dislikes the tariffs and the excise taxes because he is from a state, Virginia, that didn't have debts. And so he says it's not fair that everybody's being taxed in order to pay off some states' debts. The ones that have debts should pay that off, not everybody else. Hamilton kind of says, too bad, so sad, we're all in this together. And also there is the belief, and this is going to be a common argument about tariffs, is that tariffs hurt farmers more than anybody else. It's the poorer people that bear the brunt of that. And Jefferson just overall thinks this whole thing puts the taxation burden on the farmers, on the rural people, on the poorer people, on the lower classes, and it is at their expense. And those are people that Jefferson feels, we can't afford to be taxing those folks. So he dislikes all of it. He despises all of it, but he particularly takes issue with that bank. The other things he doesn't like, he thinks they are harmful, but this one he takes a legal issue with. Jefferson's view of the national bank is that it is unconstitutional. He believes just flat out that this is unconstitutional, that it is illegal, that Congress does not have the authority to create a national bank. He believes Congress does not have the authority to create a national bank because it is not one of Congress's enumerated powers. If we look in that list of enumerated powers in Article 1, nowhere in there does it say Congress has the ability to create a national bank. And Jefferson then argues that if it isn't there, if it does not explicitly say that they can do such a thing, then they can't. Then it's illegal and it's unconstitutional. So he says that, yes, this puts unfair tax burden on the lower classes. It is not fair to make everybody pay off debts that not everybody has, but this bank is just downright illegal and we should not have it. Now, Hamilton's argument against that, and some of you may already even be thinking this, some of you may be going, well, what about that elastic clause? And that's exactly what Hamilton says. Hamilton's view of the national bank is that it is legal, it is constitutional because of that elastic clause. And if you remember, the elastic clause said that Congress had the power to do what was necessary and proper to carry out the enumerated powers, that it stretched the power of Congress. Hamilton is arguing that, okay, maybe they didn't say that Congress has the power to create a national bank, but it does say they have the power to coin money. It does say we have the power to tax. It does say they have the ability to loan money, all that kind of stuff. That's in there. And so therefore it would be necessary and proper to create a national bank. It is implied in the elastic clause. So he is arguing that the power of Congress is stretched, that it's not limited to just those things that are in the enumerated powers. What Hamilton is arguing here is he is saying that there's also something, in addition to enumerated powers and in addition to denied powers, there's also something called implied powers. And imply means, to suggest something. Maybe you don't say it outright, but you imply it, you suggest it, even without it actually being there. Hamilton is saying there's a whole nother set of powers that Congress has that are implied. They weren't explicitly listed, but they were implied by that elastic clause. And Hamilton argues there's quite a lot of implied powers. He's really of the opinion that Congress can really do whatever they need to do, whatever they want to do, as long as they don't go into the realm of the denied powers. Some people don't agree with him on that. But he is arguing that there's such a thing as implied powers, and Jefferson argues that there is no such thing as implied powers. And for a long time, that is going to be a serious argument about whether or not these implied powers actually exist. Well, Hamilton wins this round. Washington supports him, and through some other wheeling and dealing that some of you are aware of, they eventually get the financial plan passed. All of it goes into effect. The national bank is created, the excise tax goes into effect, the tariffs go into effect, and we have assumption of state debt. And the result of that is it actually does exactly what Hamilton said it would do. It actually worked incredibly well. The national bank, I know this picture is weird. I'm going to explain it in a second. It's Hamilton and Jefferson giving each other the stink eye. But anyway, it has the effect of the debt gets paid off relatively quickly. Credit is restored really, really fast. The United States goes from being on the verge of bankruptcy and financial ruin to being, pretty healthy and having one of the highest credit ratings in the world within a few years. I mean, it's really quite amazing what it was able to do. So it does work. It does absolutely work, but it also makes some people angry because it does put the tax burden on some people more than others. And we've already seen the beginnings of this dispute between Hamilton and Jefferson. And as I've already mentioned, this is eventually going to lead to the very first political parties in this country. So that's what we're going to look at next, at sort of these deeper philosophical issues between them and how this leads to the very first political parties. Ultimately, a moment ago, we just looked at their disagreement over the national bank. But the thing is, they're disagreeing about something far bigger here. Ultimately, Hamilton and Jefferson interpret the Constitution differently. They read and understand the Constitution differently, and that leads to just disagreements about everything from that point on. So these two different versions or these different ways of interpreting the Constitution. One of those visions is what's called strict construction. Okay, strict construction, or a strict constructionist, is someone that sees the Constitution very narrowly. They see the Constitution as very strict. It's very concrete. They believe that it says what it says and it doesn't say anything else. It was meant to be taken word for word. There is no flexibility to it. It says the national government can do this and that's all they can do. The president can do this and that's all he can do. That it is meant to be just it is what it is. That's all there is. Strict construction, word for word. And as you can see here, Jefferson is more the strict constructionist. Jefferson's argument that the national bank is unconstitutional because it is not listed in the enumerated powers, that is a strict constructionist argument. And Jefferson will loosen up a little bit on that throughout his life, but right now he is a pretty staunch, strict constructionists. The other view of things is what's called loose construction. Loose construction would be the opposite. A loose constructionist sees the Constitution as more flexible. They see it as having gray areas. There's wiggle room. He's saying that it should be taken seriously, yes, absolutely seriously, but maybe not word for word, or rather that it's not just that those words are not important, but they are meant to be seen with some flexibility to them. So just because it doesn't say it doesn't necessarily mean you can't do it. That to look at it strictly could be harmful. So Hamilton is obviously the loose constructionist here who sees the gray areas and argues that there are gray areas. His argument that although the National Bank is not directly mentioned in the Constitution, that it's implied by the elastic clause, that is a loose constructionist argument. He is saying that there is flexibility here and that was always the intention of the framers. So they are going to disagree about nearly everything. And while Hamilton and Jefferson, which by the way, this is Jefferson here, giving Hamilton the mean look and the other way around, they disagree on everything. They are the face of, people. There are other people that agree with them. So Hamilton kind of becomes the face of the strict loose construction crowd, and Jefferson becomes the face of the other side. And eventually that split becomes deeper and deeper and deeper. And eventually that results in the formation of the very first political parties in this country by the time that you get to the end of the Washington administration. So let's look at those first two political parties. First of all, before we do that, dispel from your brain, get out of your mind the modern day political parties. Neither of these are the modern day political parties. Some of them may have the same name, as you can see right there, but they're not the same thing. And I'll get back to that point here in just a moment. So one of these first political parties become known as the Republicans, or actually they are the Democratic Republicans, and that usually just gets shortened to Republicans because Democratic Republican is kind of a mouthful. These are the Jeffersonians, okay? So this is Jefferson's crowd. Sometimes they're even called Jeffersonian Republicans to differentiate them from modern day Republicans or other versions of the Republican Party. So these are the Jeffersons. So the Republicans believe in strict construction. They believe overall in a smaller central government, a weaker central government. They want most of the power to be with the individual states or with the people. So, strict construction argues for a weaker central government because they're saying you can't start exercising all these powers you weren't granted. You can only do those things that were specifically mentioned, and that limits or hems in the federal government more. So they want a weaker federal or central government, more power to the states, more power to the people. Which is why they call themselves Republicans. They argue that that's what a true republic is supposed to be, that a true republic gets its power from the people, from smaller governments, from more local governments. Therefore, they're kind of arguing that we are truly the believers in Republican values, and that's why they call themselves that. Republicans tend to get more support from rural areas, from smaller farmers, from the more middle to low classes, from the South, from the West, a lot like the Anti-Federalists. So some of the same kind of crowd that would have been Anti-Federalists tend to be Republican. That's not true for all of them, but it is true for some. So smaller central government, more hemmed in central government, more power to the people, protecting agrarian interests, farmers. This whole vision that Hamilton has of an economy with banks and all this stuff is completely against what Jefferson wants. Jefferson sees a nation of small farmers. He sees agriculture, and he doesn't want banks, and he doesn't want cities, and he doesn't want industry and all those things. So they would support more of the farmers' interests, the small, regular, average, everyday guys, what they would call it. The other party that forms are called the Federalists. Now, these are not necessarily the same Federalists as your pro-Constitution Federalists, so once again, get that idea out of your head. Similar, but not the same thing. So this is an actual political party, not just people in favor of the Constitution. We are past that. But these are the Hamiltonians. Sometimes we say Hamiltonian Federalists to differentiate them between those other Federalists. So obviously the Federalists, and they get called that because they believe in a stronger federal government. They want more federal power. Thus, they believe in loose construction to give the federal government more power, to provide that flexibility for the government to exercise more powers. So they want stronger federal government, more power in the hands of the central government over that of the states. They're not opposed to state government, but they want more power in the hands of the federal government. They would, argue for implied powers and more flexibility and all that kind of stuff. Federalists tend to come from the North. They tend to be wealthier, a lot like those Federalists beforehand. But once again, they're not all the same people. For example, James Madison. James Madison was a pro-Constitution Federalist, but when it comes to these two parties, he's a Republican. So it doesn't always translate right over. But they tend to be more supported by business people, by banks, by wealthier Americans. And their policies tended to benefit those people more than the lower classes. So, people going along with policies that are going to influence or help them out the most. So our first two political parties for the next time being, they will eventually evolve into some other things, are Republicans and Federalists, with Federalists being sort of led by Hamilton and Republicans being led by Jefferson. Now, let's look at sort of another piece of the fallout of Hamilton's financial plan, and this is really going to show us a lot of really important things. So we mentioned that one of Hamilton's part of his financial plan was taxes, both tariffs and an excise tax. Well, some people really liked that, but obviously some people didn't, particularly that excise tax. The excise tax was placed on whiskey. So that means that manufacturers of whiskey are going to have to register their stills, the things they use to make whiskey, and they're going to have to pay tax based on how much whiskey they produce. But the thing is, we should realize that in this day, producers of whiskey were not big corporation conglomerates like they might be today. You're talking about farmers. This was mostly wheat and corn farmers, mostly in the western parts of states, small farms that, because they're so far out west, they grow wheat and everything, but they're so far out west that it would take them too long to actually ship their wheat or their corn to where it could be sold or, shipped off or whatever. It would rot before it could get there, because this was before there was really any kind of good transportation. So the only way most of those farmers can make money is to distill it into whiskey. So it is taxing the poorer people. Again, one of the big reasons why Jefferson was so opposed to it, he said, you're taxing the people who cannot afford it. And that's not right. So this eventually leads to an uprising, what we call the Whiskey Rebellion. So this happened out in western Pennsylvania, and these western Pennsylvania farmers are angry over this whiskey tax. They say this isn't fair. This is unfairly taxing us. It is causing us financial harm and financial ruin. And so they start an uprising. They start attacking the tax collectors. They're refusing to pay. They're setting things on fire. They're burning down their stills and burning their crops instead of, in defiance, instead of having to register them and all of that. So we have, once again, an uprising, largely over taxes, kind of like Shays' Rebellion. So we have a situation that is very, very similar. But this time we'll see a much different reaction. Now, Washington, this is the first direct challenge of the new government, direct challenge of the government under the Constitution. And Washington's kind of thinking about what to do. Jefferson probably advises him, you need to get rid of the tax. Go and negotiate with these people. He says these people are just exercising their right of free speech. They are just upset. This is what happens when you tax people who cannot afford it. I told you so. And sort of sticks up for him. Hamilton, however, has the approach of, you need to go in there and show those people who the boss is. We can't have this all the time. This is anarchy. This is mob rule, and we're not going to have that. We're going to have law and order here, whether they like it or not. And Washington agrees with Hamilton that the law must be upheld. Even if people don't like it, there's a democratic process for that. We go and vote out leaders and vote in new people if we don't like that. We don't go grab our pitchforks and our torches and go crazy every time we don't like something. So Washington's response to the Whiskey Rebellion is that he personally raises troops and leads troops into Pennsylvania to put down this rebellion. It's actually the only time a sitting president leads a military operation. Now, you may be thinking he's riding in on his horse like you see over here, and there's bloodshed and violence. It really isn't. As soon as people even hear that Washington is on his way, those farmers put down their weapons and put away their torches and start acting right. So that stops the rebellion without really even there having to be any sort of fight. But the significance of the Whiskey Rebellion is profound. The overall significance here, for one thing, if you recall Shays' Rebellion and how in that situation, the national government couldn't respond. The national government could not do anything, and that exposed the weaknesses of that government, just how weak and how dangerously weak it was. This time, the government did respond and put down this rebellion. And so this was a sign, this was symbolic that the government was strong. So this showed the strength of the new national government and showed that this was a government that could enforce its will and that could enforce the laws, that it's a much different situation now. And that was met differently by different people. To people like Hamilton, that was, yes, we have proven that this is a government that's going to get the job done. This is going to be a strong government. And yeah, people have a right to protest, but you can't take it so far. And ultimately, the rule of law has to be upheld. for people like Jefferson, this is a very foreboding sign. So Jefferson is probably more like, so this is who we are now. We go in with troops every time people are complaining. That's not what we want. So Jefferson was very much upset by this. And eventually, as well as the disagreements over the financial plan, and Washington tends to side with Hamilton on nearly everything. And so the country going in a direction that he just did not agree with, this eventually leads to Jefferson's resignation from Washington's cabinet. He resigns because he can no longer just stand by and watch things happen that he so fundamentally disagreed with. And that's the moment that a lot of historians point to as kind of being sort of the symbolic beginning of political parties. There isn't like an actual day that people go, okay, let's start political parties now. But a lot of historians, at least in a symbolic sense, note when Jefferson recognizes that those differences were so great he could not be a part of it anymore, that he resigns. That's kind of at least the symbolic beginning of that. So by the time Washington leaves office, there are two very, very clear sides developing there, much to Washington's dismay and much to many people's dismay. It was really quite disheartening for a lot of people. Now, we're still going to look at some more differences between Hamilton and Jefferson in a bit. Next time, we'll be looking at how Washington deals with foreign affairs, and we're going to see him set more precedents there, more things that he sets an example, and also more ways, more places for Jefferson and Hamilton